Frank Abagnale was a doctor, a lawyer, a co-pilot for an airline, and at age 21, he was thrown in prison for fraud. Abagnale has since spent decades teaching at the FBI Academy and working as an expert in fraud prevention and cybersecurity. His life truly is a plot twist that you'd find in the movies. Steven Spielberg must have felt the same way. The 2002 movie Catch Me If You Can is based on Abagnale's life story. I had a chance to sit down with Frank and talk about his life and his career.
I ran away from home at 16 when my parents got a divorce, ended up on the streets of New York at 16. Back then, a lot of people in the 60s got into Haight-Ashbury, the hippie scene, the drug scene. I started realizing that at 16 I had to make people believe I was a lot older or they wouldn't deal with me. So
I've read you were having trouble getting
Right.
jobs,
So
and they didn't pay you much.
So I altered my driver's license, but back then was just an IBM card, didn't have a photo on it, and I changed one digit on it to my year of birth. So that made me 26 years old. And I had started writing checks, and of course, when the money ran out, I kept writing the checks, and the police started looking for me as a runaway and for the bad checks, and then I ended up impersonating an airline pilot for a couple of years. I was a doctor in a Georgia hospital for a while. I passed the state bar exams in Louisiana, practiced law there for a year. And I was eventually arrested by the French police when I was 21 in southern France, convicted in French court of law and sent to French prison. I was later extradited to Sweden. I served time in the Swedish prisons and later brought back to the United States where a U.S. federal judge sentenced me to 12 years in federal prison. I served 4 of the 12 years at a federal prison in Virginia. And then when I was 26, the government offered to take me out of prison on the condition I go to work with an agency for the government for the remainder of my sentence or until my parole had been satisfactorily
Well, what made them
completed.
think, well, first of all, I've been curious, what book of checks did you have to write all those hot checks on?
Oh, I would just go open accounts. You know, I did a lot of things that always were, I never thought premeditated, just as an opportunity. I'd gone into a bank and opened a checking account and gave them a phony identification and a $100 deposit. And I knew that in 2 weeks they'd mail me 200 printed checks with that name and that information. I'd cash those checks. But being young, I was very inquisitive, so I said to the young lady, I noticed you didn't give me any deposit slips. She said, no, they come from the bank check printer. They'll be in the back of your checkbook. You'll get them in about 10 days. Well, what if I want to make a deposit tomorrow? Well, you'll have to go over to the table in the lobby, help yourself to a blank deposit slip, write your account number in, use those till you get your printed ones. So I walked over and I took a big stack of them off the shelf. I went back, I kept looking at them and thinking about it. So the next day I went down and bought a Burroughs magnetic encoder, which looked like a big adding machine, and I magnetically encoded my account number the bank had assigned to me the day before. Then I went back to the bank, put them on the shelf in the lobby, and everyone who came in put their money in my account. So I did a lot of different things when it came to the check.
That's incredible. And the story of your airline pilot tenure is fascinating.
Same thing, you know. I always say that being an adolescent, I had no fear of being caught. I had no fear of consequences. Had it been older, 21, 25, I probably would have rationalized everything I did and said it'll never work. But it was very difficult to go in a bank where you didn't have a bank account to cash a check. So the teller would send you to a bank officer. You'd give him a story, and sometimes he or she would okay the check, but they were small amounts. And then one day I was walking down the street in Manhattan. I saw an airline crew come out of a hotel, and I thought to myself, wow, if I could get one of these pilot uniforms, then I go in the bank as a pilot over on a layover, and I bet they'd cash my check in a minute. And this is, of course, back before ATMs and even credit cards. And sure enough, I was able to finagle the uniform. I got the uniform. It was night and day.
It was some uniform store, wasn't it?
Yeah, what I did is I basically called Pan Am and said that I was a Pan Am pilot and that I was on the layover, and I had sent my uniform out through the hotel to have it cleaned. And now the cleaner in the hotel couldn't find it. And I had a flight in a few hours, so they sent me down to the Well-Built Uniform Company, which was their vendor. They fitted me out in the uniform, and next thing I had the uniform. And it was night and day. When I went in the bank, they never questioned anything. They saw only the uniform, and I realized that worked very quickly.
So did you ever fly an airplane?
No, and there was a great scene in the movie at a TWA, which actually happened at the TWA terminal at JFK, where I had gone up to the counter in the uniform to buy a ticket. And so the agent said to me, are you buying or you riding? I said, I don't understand. Are you purchasing a ticket or are you riding the jump seat? I said, Well, no, I'll ride the jump seat. And then I realized that I could fly all over the world for free by riding up in the cockpit of the jump seat.
But you never flew
But I never
Pan
had
Am.
to fly the plane. I never flew Pan Am because I was afraid people would question who I knew and who I didn't know and all those kind
Well, you had another career there for a while.
of. As the doctor in the
yeah,
hospital
yeah,
in Georgia.
doctor. Did you actually?
And again, all these things I kind of fell into. If I had said to myself, I'm going to Georgia and I'm going to apply to be a doctor, I actually moved into an apartment complex, and it was a singles complex. And on the application for the apartment, it asked occupation. And I didn't want to write airline pilot because I knew they were looking for me as the airline pilot. So I just thought to myself, doctor. So I wrote it down. But the apartment manager was very inquisitive. She says, oh, I see you're a doctor. I said, oh, yes. She said, what type of doctor are you? I said, well, I'm a medical doctor, but I'm not practicing medicine right now. I came to Atlanta to invest in some real estate. Oh, really? Well, what type of medical doctor? And I figured being a singles complex, pediatrician would be pretty safe. So I moved in, but then I met a real doctor who lived there that was a pediatrician, and we became friends, and then he introduced me to people at the hospital. And then when they had a position open just temporarily for someone whose parents passed away, they asked me if I would cover the shift in administrative capacity. So being the young kiddo, I said, well, let me see if I can get away with it, and I did it.
So,
But again, if I had planned it, it would have never worked.
so were you doing the same sort of thing in Europe when you were arrested?
In Europe, I actually had stopped doing all of these things. I lived in a little town called Montpellier, which is a college town in southern France. And I always knew I'd get caught. You know, sooner or later they're going to catch up with you. It was just a matter of time. And sure enough, an Air France stewardess recognized me from a wanted poster, and she reported to the authorities. She saw me there, and the French police arrested me. And immediately the Swedish police put a warrant for my arrest for forgery in Sweden, but the French first caught me, so they convicted me of forgery in France and sent me to French prison.
What was that
first.
like?
The French prisons were very bad. It's a whole different philosophy about you go to prison to be punished. You don't go to prison to lift weights and live in air conditioning.
Rehabilitation.
Yeah, there's no rehabilitation. It's all about punishment. So it was a very severe place. I thought Steven Spielberg did a good job of showing it. He went back and researched during the time I was there what the prisons were like.
I read you had a blanket on the
Yeah,
the
blanket
floor.
on the floor, hole in the floor to go to the bathroom, no plumbing, no electricity. It was very dark. And then you went from that environment to the Swedish prisons, which were the total opposite. It was like going to spend the night at the Holiday Inn. They were the exact opposite of the French prisons. And then, of course, the American prisons somewhere in the middle of those two.
As I watched the movie and then read the story, I mean, you've had books, movies, Broadway play. I mean, you're well chronicled. But my curiosity was, what was it that the FBI saw in you that they thought they could use? Because really, you just were really good at conning people.
Right, and absolutely. So the first 5 years, I just did undercover work. And what the whole asset that the Bureau saw in me was that they could literally say to me, I need you in the next 2 weeks to take up this information. You're a lieutenant in the Army. You've been in the Army for this many years. Your expertise is this particular missile. And I need you to go to the base, and I need you to find out this information. They knew that they could put me in any position that I could fake long enough in that position to find out whatever they wanted me to find out.
So in a perverse kind of way,
I was doing the same thing.
There was an admiration for what you were
was able
doing.
to do.
Because Tom Hanks played the FBI agent that was...
who and I were friends for 30 years. He was a wonderful man, and he was who I reported to for the first 10 years till he retired. And then after about 5 years, I was involved in some cases that got a lot of notoriety in the media. People started to realize I was involved in that and who I really was. So the Bureau took me off that.
Undercover.
Yeah, and when they asked me about staying, or I decided to stay, then they started realizing I'd be a great asset to teach at the FBI Academy. So I've been at the Academy 40 years. I've taught 2 generations of FBI agents.
And what do you
there.
teach?
Everything's changed. You know, when I first went there, it was all about counterfeiting, forgery, embezzlement, financial crimes. Now, the last 20 years, all about cybercrime.
What do you see as the types of fraud and cybersecurity breaches that we're going to be experiencing in the next few years?
Well, we expect between now and 2021 to have about $6 trillion in losses from cybercrime. We're already at 1.7 trillion. But what's going to get real scary is that we're getting developed such technology today where, for example, we can shut someone's pacemaker off. because it's a Bali device with a chip in it. But we have to be within 35 feet of them to do that. So I have to walk by you on the street and get close to you to do that. We can pull over a vehicle because the vehicle, typical vehicle, has 240 computer components in it. We can shut the person in the car, lock the doors, lock the window, turn on the airbag. But again, we're restricted and limited by a distance of usually 35 feet. My question is, in 5 years, what if that's 50 miles or 500 miles or 2,000 miles away? So I think what's going to happen with cyber, up until this point, it's all financial, stealing money, stealing data. Data is money. But I'm afraid that in the next 5, 10 years, it's all going to be more about doing harm, whether it be breaking into banks and destroying their system, getting into the financial system, the electrical grid, or just assassinating people from a distance away.
A lot of students will be watching this. What message do you have for them in this evolving world of technology?
I think the best advice, first of all, 2 pieces of advice. I would absolutely say that if I was a young person today, I would want to get into learning all about cybersecurity, because that's the future. I don't mean writing code. I'm talking about recognizing ransom and malware and getting into the actual security of cybersecurity. That's where the future is going to be, and that's where companies, corporations, and governments will be looking for people who have those kind of backgrounds and knowledge. As a personal piece of advice, you know, we always hear that life is short. But the truth is that life is actually pretty long. So, you know, someone from my generation might live to be in their 90s. Someone from my son's generation could live well to be over 100. So when you make a mistake in life, when you mistreat someone, when you lie to someone, you deceive someone, you bully someone, you have to eventually live with that. At the time, it means nothing to you, but as you start to get older and you look back on your life and you've done something or you've hurt somebody, that comes back to haunt you a great deal, and you have to live with that for many, many years. So I always tell people, before you do something, before you act, before you mistreat someone, mislead someone, bully someone, ask yourself if you really want to have that burden and carry that burden for the rest of your life, because you will as you get older. You don't think so now, but you will, and again, life is long, so you have to live with that burden for a long, long time.
Abagnale spoke in Tulsa and Oklahoma City as part of the Executive Management Briefing Series sponsored by the Spears School of Business. The series is a great opportunity to hear from top business leaders and experts. What you just heard was just part of my interview. To hear more, including how you can protect yourself from cyber attack and fraud, download the Inside OSU podcast from the iTunes Store or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Vern Sargis. We'll see you on the next Inside OSU.